Good evening again. If I may have your attention. Good evening. So as I said earlier, reunions serve as an opportunity to reconnect with fellow classmates, connect with the different generations of law alumni, but also to reflect on your own time as a student at Myron Taylor Hall and the transformative experiences here that helped shape you as a person and a professional. And that's exactly what the best teachers do, shape you as a critical thinker, a lifelong learner, and as a professional. For 47 years, Cornell Law School has had one of the great teachers in Faust F. Rossi, the Samuel S. Leibowitz Professor of Trial Techniques, who has helped train literally thousands of Cornell law students and many other lawyers across the country. No other faculty member in the history of Cornell Law School has taught as many students as Faust Rossi has. He's the longest serving law professor in the history of the law school, teaching some of the largest courses. He's taught widely over the curriculum, but in recent decades, and we do measure his career in decades, in recent decades mainly taught civil procedure, evidence, and trial advocacy. His hypotheticals are legendary and his delivery impeccable. I arranged the program and I am definitely speaking before he does. Faust is, of course, a 1960 graduate of our law school. After a stint as a trial attorney in the Department of Justice Honors Program and as a litigation partner in Rochester, he joined the Cornell Law School faculty in 1966. He's a national winner of the Roscoe Pound Jacobson Award for excellence in teaching trial advocacy, recurring visiting professor at the Central European University of Budapest, and the longtime faculty member in the Cornell Summer Institute in International and Comparative Law in Paris. He's given hundreds, if not thousands, of lectures to lawyers and judges in the United States and Europe. Now, as many of you know, our Moot Court program holds 3 internal competitions each year. The Langfan Family Moot Court competition is a competition for our first-year students, and the Kucha Cup competition in the fall. And then we have the Winter Cup. Ooh, why name it the Winter Cup? That doesn't play to our advantages. It's not the best name for a competition. So recently, a group of generous alumni joined forces to endow and name the Winter Cup. And due to their generosity, we are pleased to announce that it will from now on be called the Faust Rossi Moot Court Competition. Now, Faust has long been a beloved teacher. One of my tasks as dean is to review the confidential student evaluations from each professor, make sure that teaching standards are being maintained. I'm going to break that confidence tonight by sharing just a few representative comments that students made during his very last semester of teaching. Here's just a small sampling. I actually haven't even asked Faust for his permission. Not sure he's read these. But you'll hear them. Quote, Professor Rossi is captivating and made every lecture a true joy. He is able to inspire creative thought about the material while keeping the class engaged with his colorful characters, my favorite being Harvey. I had Professor Rossi for Civ Pro and now Evidence. He was by far my favorite professor, both times. Sorry for the rest of the faculty here tonight. And my favorite overall. He will be missed. Another student, quote, thanks for the good times, Madge, Harvey, Baby Grutz, Spano, Victor, and the whole gang, end quote. I think you had to be there to know what that means, but so many of you were and know exactly what that means. Another student, Quote, "What a wonderful experience to learn the subject from someone with such mastery of the material. The best aspect of the class was Mr. Rossi's colorful use of storytelling and illustrative hypotheticals, reminiscent of Abraham Lincoln," end quote. Finally, quote, "A Titan is leaving our school. I am sad." Well, this is not a time for sadness, it's a time to celebrate Faust. I've asked two of his former students to help us do that and a longtime faculty colleague. I literally could have, we could have had any one of thousands of students who would be willing to take up this task, and many colleagues, because he's literally touched the lives of so many. But I'm delighted that a couple of his beloved students have agreed to do so. First is Kevin Arquette, a partner at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett, who I'd like to invite to the podium just in a minute. He's a member of the class of 1978, celebrating his 35th reunion. A partner at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett in New York City. He has a preeminent antitrust litigator and counselor, and has many accolades and awards that attesting to his high standing in the antitrust bar. And Kevin was a key person in the effort to name the Rossi Cup, and I want to personally thank him for his generosity in those efforts. Kevin, if you'll come say a few words.
Knowing there were thousands that wanted to be here tonight, I hope I was fairly high on the list, but time will tell. Actually, my classmates who are sitting with me at the table tonight just gave me one word as I came up here, which was, "Don't embarrass us, Kevin." Okay? But in any event, it's really a pleasure to be able to come up here and to make a couple of comments about Professor Rossi. As we all know, he's one of the all-time great professors this school has ever had. And as Dean Schwab said, of course, he's also the longest-serving faculty member of all time, having come to the law school in 1966. Of course, we will all deny any connection between those two events. But I got to tell you, everyone else knows what he's done, so I just want to talk about my own personal observations, because the accolades and so on go on so long, it would be repetitive to get into that. I have to tell you, first and foremost, it was just a joy to be in his classroom. He would be able to describe the driest and most arcane subject matter in a way that was enlightening, entertaining, and memorable. Now, a lot of you probably don't share this in common with me, but there were several of us that had to rely on the bathtub method of preparing for final exams, which essentially means that you've fallen so far behind in the semester that you need to cram all the information in the night before the exam, knowing that most of it will be flushed out 24 hours afterwards. And that being the case, to think of a teacher as memorable and his lessons as memorable is quite remarkable. But I can't tell you how many times now I've got some issue, some problem. I took both civil procedure and evidence, Professor Rossi, and there's some issue. I know we covered this first or second year class. And I think back, and I'm thinking of Del Vecchio, Yuckel, Grutz. Eventually the story comes to me, and the rule of law follows. So, you know the story, you know the rule of law. And for a long time I thought, what a great gift to be both memorable and entertaining. And it took me a long time to realize that Professor Rossi isn't both. He's memorable because he is entertaining. And it's just been such a gift to be able to have taken courses from him. Now, to this day, and I really don't understand, maybe you'll explain this when you get to the microphone, but I don't understand how somebody who has accomplished so much is so reluctant to have people recognize what he's done. I got to think you're one of those kids that hated compliments. Am I right about that? Yeah, I think probably. Okay, well, that's right. But Indeed, I don't think I've ever seen Professor Rossi accept an award or an honor where he didn't start his remarks with, "I really don't deserve this award." Okay? Now, I'm hoping that perhaps you can find some comfort in Jack Benny's view on all this. I mean, Jack Benny was given a lot of awards, and he was him say, "I don't deserve this award, but then again, I have arthritis. I don't deserve that either." He also observed that modesty is something that's only available to the most highly talented, and actually for those of ordinary talent, it's only called honesty. So I think when we call Professor Rossi modest, we're understating, but actually pointing out what an incredible human being this is. Now, to refresh my recollection today, as I realized I had to get up here tonight, just say a few minutes worth of material, I went through the social network blogs. You know, they say everything about everything, but I went through them to just see what today's students say about you. And of course, nothing's changed. He's still described as brilliant, entertaining, clear, and spontaneous. Well, on that last one, I had to pause a little bit, the spontaneous, because I'm actually somebody who has a little bit of insight into that element of Professor Rossi's character. Going back to my first year, I lived in Hughes Hall. That was at that time, it was completely used as a residence for the law students with beautiful views of Cayuga Lake. Well, beautiful for some. Actually, my view was of the faculty parking lot. No doubt a consequence of the fact that I only emerged from the admissions waiting list 3 or 4 days before classes began. But in any event, I was an early riser in law school, not so much because I was enthusiastic about the day to come, but because I was fearful and embarrassed that I'd be called on in class if I wasn't prepared. And I got up very early, and I have to say, with my view of the parking lot, I can tell you without fear of contradiction that the very first car in the parking lot every day, every single day, was that of Faust Rossi. There were days when the car was there before I woke up, so I saw the tracks leading in, snow accumulating in the car. It was Faust Rossi, I can tell you, and he was there because he was preparing for our classes. That's the kind of dedication you just have to see, and you know as students of his exactly how great that was. Well, we were talking about spontaneity, weren't we? So all I can say about that is, I think of what Winston Churchill used to say to his secretary, which was, "Please don't interrupt me as I prepare my impromptu remarks." I'll just end with an example of Professor Rossi's incredible talent for being able to encapsulate huge numbers of ideas in a very few number of words, often in one sentence. Unbelievable what he had to do this. Now, we have to go back to 1978 as Dean Schwab, the year I graduated, a long time ago, and our class voted Professor Rossi the most outstanding professor we had had during our entire 3-year period. Well, there was a wrinkle in that because some found it remarkable that, in fact, in our 3rd year, Professor Rossi wasn't on campus. He was enjoying a sabbatical. Well, so actually, as he accepts the award, he gave the usual at the beginning, "I don't deserve this award." Then he gave us a few life lessons, and he concluded by giving a huge shout out to his fellow faculty members, things I remember to this day. And what he said is, "And finally, in accepting this award, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to my fellow Cornell Law faculty members, because what I would like to say is that they made doing nothing look great." So, as Dean Schwab said, with apologies to the other faculty members here tonight, it was a great line. We loved it. Thank you, Professor Rossi. It's such an honor to be able to say a few words about you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And now I'd like to ask Steve Robinson to come to the podium to say a few words. Currently a partner at Skadden Arps and a member of its policy committee. His practice focuses on litigation, corporate internal investigations, government enforcement matters, commercial disputes. He joined Skadden in 2010. Prior to that, he was the Honorable Judge Robinson, serving as federal judge for the United States District Court, Southern District of New York, being appointed by President George Bush in 2003. Showing his bipartisan nature, Steve had earlier been appointed the U.S. Attorney for Connecticut by President Bill Clinton, where he served for 3 years. And he's had a distinguished career sort of in private practice, industry, government service, and now is a partner at Skadden Arps. Steve, if you'll come to the podium. Thank you.
Well, good evening, all. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about a professor that I greatly admire. And before I came here today, last night, I was talking to my daughter, reminding her that I would be traveling to Ithaca today to give this 5-minute speech about Professor Rossi. And having lived with me, obviously, her entire life, and for the last 12 years as a single parent, she had heard me mention Professor Rossi on many occasions. And so when I told her I was going to give a 5-minute speech this evening, she said, "Do they know what you think about Faust Rossi?" And I said, "Yes, I think they do, and that's why they asked me to come here and talk about him." And then she paused and said, "Do they know that you like to talk?" And seeing the trap being laid for me, I remained silent, and she paused again and said, "Professor Rossi, 5 minutes, good luck to them." And so you'll forgive me if I take a moment or two longer than 5 minutes, because in my view, Professor Rossi is worthy of every second, of every minute of thought and words that I can give. And I'd like to talk about him from two perspectives. The first perspective is one that many of you share with me, and that's a general perspective of being a student of his and what that meant. And for those of you who haven't had the great good honor of participating in one of his classes, it was for me a revelation in law school. I was fortunate enough to take both evidence and trial practice from Professor Rossi. And it was like the law suddenly became technicolor. That is, there were many professors at Cornell who I admire greatly and got to know well over my time there, but there was something about the moments in his class that were revelatory. Not only was he able to unpack the intricacies of the rules of evidence and make them sort of understandable to us, but he did it in such a way that he posted lasting memories for me and for, I would dare say, most of you who've had the opportunity to sit in one of his classes. And so for me, in many ways, that came back to me over the years, because as a federal judge, I was often called upon to make quick decisions about objections, about evidentiary issues that were going on in my courtroom. And I always felt a level of comfort because I could relate back to a still vivid story 20 or 25 years later from Professor Rossi. And so when there were issues of refreshing recollection, I remembered the witness Vinny, who had his memory refreshed by the plate of fettuccine Alfredo being served under him and the smells of it made him remember being in the restaurant at the time when a particular conversation was had, and I understood when Faust Rossi said, so you can use almost anything to refresh a recollection. And when I taught trial practice at Yale Law School, I tried to be Faust Rossi. And so I know that I couldn't be him. I could not describe in the technicolor detail the way he described the rules of evidence and the ways in which those rules of evidence should come into play. But it did allow me to take his words. And so I didn't try sort of to talk about Vinny and some of the other colorful characters that Professor Rossi had used to enliven this text for me and for us, and I dare say for you. But what it did allow me to do was talk about the concepts that were so vivid in my mind because he led me there. So when he talked about developing theme and how do you humanize your witness and all of the ways in which a good lawyer, a good trial lawyer does their craft, to the extent that I ever did any of that well, to the extent that I could ever teach any of that, it was because of what Professor Rossi had taught me, and I was never ashamed of that. And so my daughter, having no interest in the law, never caring to be a lawyer, grew up hearing me talk about this man that she has never, to this day, met. One day in sort of my crazy about something that happened, and I'll tell you when that was, I literally sat with my daughter and we Googled pictures of Faust Rossi because she had to see this man who I was talking about, who had now become a mythological figure in our household. I remember the specific evening that this happened. We were watching The Sopranos, and it was the final episode of the first season. And it was a particular point in the episode where Tony Soprano is talking to his mother, Livia, and he says to her, he's basically relating to her that he understands that she's the person that okayed the attempted assassination of him, right? And he's saying, you know, Ma, how could you? I'm your only son, and I know what you did. And at that point, my wife was alive, who was a professor at Yale Law School, formerly a professor at Cornell. And my daughter and I are watching, and I then went into my best full Faust Rossi mode. So I turned to my wife and I turned to my daughter, who was 9, could not have cared less about law. And I said, could he be forced to testify about what he's just said? Because in his testimony, it would implicate criminal activity on his part. So though there would be clearly no spousal privilege, could his testimony be compelled? If it were compelled, is it hearsay? And if it is hearsay, what are the exceptions? And so my daughter, who had no interest in the law, has never had an interest in the law, was bombarded constantly in her life with these moments where Faust Rossi invaded our lives and home. And so I must thank him for that. And it's because I got to share those stories with my wife, with my daughter, with the students that I taught, with the lawyers who appeared before me in court in my time as a trial attorney when I was an assistant U.S. attorney. It's because of that that I actually seemed interesting. Because other than with my family, I never attributed these incredible insights or these great stories to Faust Rossi. They were mine. And so to the extent that I have managed to do some of the things I've managed to do in my career, it's in large part because people thought I was insightful and funny and smart, and I was just doing a pale imitation of Faust Rossi. And so I am here to praise Faust Rossi and not to retire him. Because to retire him means he has somehow gone away. Now, it is true that he will not teach at the law school anymore. but he will live. Most of us, if we're lucky, get to live in the lives of our family and close friends. And so even when we are removed by time or distance or life circumstances, we are in their memories. Faust Rossi has that times several thousand. Because whether or not he continues to teach at Cornell, he will live in me. He will live in me in the way that I do what I do, in the way that I talk about what I do, and in my ability to act certainly first as a lawyer, second as a storyteller. Because to the extent that I am a storyteller, it is again my pale imitation of Faust Rossi. So I'm going to bore you one more minute with a very personal account. Because Faust Rossi was not only a professor that I admired, a professor who informed and educated me, and was not only a professor who I imitated, often badly. But I always reflect back on the time when I was a second year. I had taken evidence from Professor Rossi, and now I was in trial evidence. And although I seemed to some like a person of massive ego, that's probably true now, and great confidence, that's probably true now, it was not true then. I was a second year at Cornell who could not figure out if I could actually do this well. And so on one side, there were grades, and that was fine. And on another side, I had spent a lot of time with my great good friend Barry Strom in the clinical program, which was essential to my growth as a lawyer. But I still didn't understand. I still didn't have the confidence. I still didn't have an intact enough ego to believe that I could actually do this well. And so there are two moments I want to tell you about, and they're little moments, and they're ones that I dare say Professor Rossi would not remember, because it was an evidence of who he was on a day-to-day level, but since on these particular moments he touched me, they became meaningful in my life. One day it was an afternoon, and we were going to trial advocacy, trial practice here, and we were walking down the hallway to the classroom. And he came up behind me and he threw his arm around my shoulders. And he said, "Steve, I think you can be really good at this." That moment changed everything. That moment took this boy from the Brooklyn projects who grew up in a home without a father and had someone who I admired, who I wanted to imitate, and in fact would imitate, who I believed held the keys of wisdom to the profession that I wanted to enter. And that brief moment, the comment and the arms across my shoulder meant everything. The notion that he could believe in me led me to believe in me. And so those who know me now with the massive ego and the outsized thoughts about his self and his ability don't see that scared second-year student inside. I believe that Faust saw that and felt that he wanted to lend his words to who I was. And in doing that, he built who I was. He allowed me to get through my last year and a half of law school with a sense that I had a role in this profession and that I could, in fact, do it. And so in my introduction, Dean Schwab mentioned a couple of the jobs that I've had. I've actually had 10 in the almost 30 years I've been a lawyer. And what allowed me to move from job to job, what allowed me the opportunity to do the things that I've done, was built on a foundation of confidence that Faust Rossi provided for me. The second thing that he did occurred after I graduated. So now I'm out in the practice of law and a young associate at what would now be considered a boutique firm. Back in the olden days, it was a medium-sized law firm. And I'm just working, and one day I get a phone call. And the phone call is from Professor Rossi, and he says that he is being nominated for the Roscoe Pound Award. And as part of that process, he has to submit recommendations from a couple of students, and he wanted to call and ask if I would write a recommendation for him. And I was flabbergasted. I knew that as a student, he had said to me he thought that I might have some talent in this, and that was meaningful to me. It's meaningful to me to this day. But this phone call, after I had left, and the notion that of many of the recent students that he had, he would reach out to me and ask me to write a recommendation for him, both at the same time was absurd, that I would be a person in a position to recommend him for anything, but it was also incredibly gratifying, and it was a moment that I grew. It is that day that I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I thought I could never get into the U.S. Attorney's Office, because even though I had some foundation laid by Faust Rossi as a law student and some confidence instilled in me, I had heard that if you wanted to be a real trial lawyer, you need to go and practice in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the best one was the Southern District of New York. And so I had heard stories about people who had clerked at the Supreme Court who had been rejected from that office, people who had been practicing for 4, 5, 6, 7 years had been rejected from that office. And it never occurred to me that I could get in that office until the day that Faust Rossi called me and asked me to write a recommendation. And so that day, my nervous hand began to draft what ended up being 20 or 30 drafts of a letter and recommendation of Faust Rossi. And then it also began to fill out the application to the U.S. Attorney's Office. For reasons I won't bore you with, I was lucky enough to get in there, and my career trajectory changed. And so when we write our own myth, when we write our own history, the question for all of us is, even if you are totally honest, what are the events? What are the moments that moved you forward? Who are the people that touched your life in a way that allowed you to move forward? And so there are always events that you can talk about. But my feelings about Faust Rossi have not evolved in light of tonight's events. As Dean Schwab can tell you, I have told him about these events for years. Because as I write my history, as I try to place some understanding of how I came from a kid with 2 brothers and a single mother in a housing project in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, to get to do some of the things that I've gotten to do. One story I could write is because I'm brilliant. And you know what? You would be surprised. Some people would actually believe that, because there would be an assumption that you didn't get to do all of the things that I've gotten to do, that you didn't have 2 presidents of different parties nominate you for positions unless you were really smart. But that's not the story that I tell, because in my view of who I am, that would not be a truthful story. The truthful story has 2 measures of Faust Rossi in it. So I want to take this moment publicly to thank you. I'd also like to take this moment for your family, for them to understand how many there are like me. How many of us over the years, over the 47 years, over the hundreds and thousands of Cornell students and students elsewhere who your father, who your grandfather, who your husband touched, and how our lives were made better. I honor you, I admire you, and I love you. Thank you.
Professor Kevin Clermont, the Robert D. Ziff Professor of Law, is himself a renowned professor of civil procedure and co-author of one of the leading casebooks in the field. He joined the Cornell Law School faculty in 1974, which means that those doing the math, he's thus been a colleague and fellow civil procedure professor with Faust for 39 years. I therefore thought it highly appropriate to ask him to say a few words. Thank you, Kevin.
I am mercifully the last to say goodbye to Faust Rossi. I have waited for this night for years. I started my teaching career against Rudy Schlesinger, whereby my very existence literally sent my section students to the dean to complain, reportedly in terms of denial of human rights. But blessedly, Rudy soon retired. I was ready. But into Rudy's huge civil procedure shoes stepped one Faust Rossi. He'd been teaching at Cornell, only a decade, but he had already attained the status of legend. I have consequently spent my teaching career in his shadow. Fortunately, I still view myself as a boy wonder rather than as Prince Charles. So tomorrow I am ready to step into the sunlight. However, tonight I am not so self-absorbed that I cannot acknowledge that my moment of personal triumph is a tragedy for the school. Faust will leave a void. As a teacher, he has no peer. Indeed, it really is impossible to convey to anyone his effectiveness, his popularity, except to an audience that had the joy of having studied under him. We don't know his secret. If we did, we'd all be doing it. I personally suspect there's more to it than using Italian names for the characters in memorable, clever hypotheticals. His teaching has benefited a lot more than Cornell students. He's brought the school nationwide fame through his celebrated bar review lectures. So funny, so communicative, in technicolor. I've heard all too often, Cornell, that's the school where Faust Rossi teaches. He's also, carried the load around the law school as the face of the school to our students. The go-to guy for speechifying around Myron Taylor. There are also the alumni courses, his speeches on the great trials. Often overlooked, though, is his teaching at the other end of the funnel, his introduction to law, especially in the Cornell Law School's summer Paris program. After almost 20 years of teaching his introduction to American law in Cornell, he's become quite a man about town in Paris. He's ensconced in the very chic apartment of CNN's Jim Bitterman in the 7th arrondissement on the Boulevard Raspail. He's come a long, long way from Rochester. As a scholar, his work has been mainly in trial practice and evidence, but he's brought that to bear in civil procedure. So that he's been my intellectual companion for almost 40 years. Also my companion at countless lunches where we've discussed current events. President Clinton kept us going for years. High culture. Faust has stuck with me for 26 seasons of Survivor. And based on that latter, I can testify that this man is a master strategist and a student of human nature. He has regularly rated in the top 1% of the national rankings in online Survivor prediction contests. As a colleague, one word will do, and that's wisdom. Always on the correct side of academic issues, always a source of calmingly sage advice. He's been a wonderfully beneficial presence around the school, standing up for principle, defending and indeed befriending unpopular colleagues and students around the university, serving on endless committees and dean searches for that matter. We'll miss him in the collegial function as much as in those other functions. Yet, the time has come for him to depart. A time for knee replacements and such. Not for him, but for his beloved toy poodle, Billy. I'm pretty sure that Faust's departure is going to be a lot more traumatic for us than for him, because I fear he prefers Billy to any of us. I have learned from Faust recently that dogs have only 2 knees, and that replacing even one knee costs a fortune. But 2 new knees lie in Billy's immediate future. Billy is a certified therapy dog, which I view as Faust's one ethical lapse, so that Billy goes everywhere with Faust and Charlene. Except Billy's not here tonight, I find, because it turns out Billy refuses to go to the opera, and I now learn to retirement dinners, so he's not here. But at least Charlene came. And, you know, yes, Charlene. Of all the things that I admire about Faust, his beautifully close relationship with Charlene tops the list. Faust is, first and foremost, a family man. Billy's not alone in his heart. Thus, tonight we commemorate a tragedy for the law school, but we can console ourselves with the thought that this is no tragedy for Faust or for me. He goes off to a happy future with Billy and Charlene, his 3 sons, their grandchildren, all fill the head table up here tonight. And so I can, with confidence, send Faust off with our very grand thank you.
And now I invite Faust to say a few words, if you will.
Can I have a tape of all that? I listened carefully to the comments by the dean, by Kevin Arquette, Kevin Clermont, and Steve Robinson. All that praise, all that undeserved praise. I wasn't sure who they were talking about, but I guess it was me. It certainly described how I would like to be remembered. It was a bit overdone, I think. But I suppose exaggeration at an affair like this is tolerable. I was reminded, though, of the words of that famous passenger on the Titanic, the one who, as he stood on the sinking ship with a glass of scotch in hand, said, "I know I rang for ice, but this is ridiculous." Having listened to the glowing and gracious comments, I thought maybe I shouldn't retire. But this hardly seemed like the appropriate occasion to announce that I refuse to retire. Let's do it all again next year. Actually, I have to tell you that those fictional characters that everybody is talking about, when you create characters like Harvey and Madge and Grutz and Spano and Del Vecchio and the like, and then you use them over and over again in your hypotheticals, they tend to become real. So I had a dream the other night, and they all appeared to me in the dream. And what they said was, "You're going to retire and you didn't consult us? You're going to retire, fine. They're going to have a ceremony for you. They're going to say glowing things, but they're going to name a moot court competition after you. But what about us? What happens to us? You retire and we're dead." Well, I'm not sure that's true based on what I've heard tonight. But at any rate, I mollified the group by promising them a Facebook page. All of this praise, I want you to know, does not go to my head. Because Charlene, my wonderful wife, keeps me grounded in reality. Before as I was dressing for this event, I was looking in the mirror, fixing my tie, and I said to Charlene, "How many great law teachers do you think there are in Cornell Law School, or have been in Cornell Law School?" And she said, "One less than you think." At a time like this, I guess it's natural to think about your career and choices presented and decisions made. And I think I made two brilliant, fortunate decisions. One was to marry my wife, Charlene, and the other one was to come here to Cornell and teach, first as a student and then as a teacher some 10 years later. Cornell has been a part of my life, a huge part of my life, and the life of my family. To say that I will miss it is an enormous understatement. It was almost my entire life when I was a student, from 1957 to 1960. And then when I came back to teach some years later, I've been doing it now for 47 wonderful years. Our three sons all benefited from an education in the university. 2 of them did, and 1 of them in the law school. Cornell, when I was here as a student, was what I would call a good law school. Today, it's a great one. Better really in every respect. A much more diverse student body and a faculty, a greater number of excellent teachers in a variety of different disciplines, and what a wonderful place to teach. I've taught fathers and mothers, their sons and daughters. I've visited a number of other law schools and educational institutions. NYU, San Diego, Emory, Oxford, University of Siena, Central European University in Budapest. The quality of our students is comparatively superb. The degree of their preparation exceeds that, as far as I'm concerned, of any other law school that I know and that I've heard about in the country. Now, that may be a function of location, not too many distractions in Ithaca, New York, but whatever the cause, it makes teaching a wonderful experience. If you define work as something unpleasant, as a chore that has to be done so that you can earn money, support your family, I want to tell you that since I came to Cornell, I haven't worked a day in my life. The joy of teaching here is immense. And one of the great blessings of teaching is the enormous satisfaction that comes from seeing the growth and the success of our students. We have some excellent examples in Kevin Arquette and in Steve Robinson. I remember Steve very well as a student. He came later and he took more of my courses, and he took trial advocacy. But my memory of how he performed is a little different from mine. I enjoyed teaching trial advocacy mainly because you could see the progress. In other words, you'd start out 1 week, and one student and another student would not be able to frame a proper question. And then 3 weeks later, they were conducting competent exercises in direct and cross-examination. And that would give me a wonderful feeling. Now, I didn't get that wonderful feeling from Steve Robinson because my memory is he was so good when he first entered the course. So it's perfectly understandable that I would say, you're going to be good at this, because he already was good at this. And I'm not sure I really improved anything in his ability, except maybe to give him strength to persevere. But of all the years that I taught trial advocacy, Steve Robinson is the one I remember the most and is also the best of all those students that I can remember. I apologize to anyone who took trial advocacy. I confess that when I first started to teach, there were a few bumps. What Kevin Arquette said about my car being in the lot early in the morning, well, I found that teaching was more difficult than I thought. For one thing, it seemed to me like it was a lot like trying a new case every day, keeping ahead of the students. The difference between trying a case was instead of 6 or 12 jurors sitting there, there were 50 or 100 students, some talking, some quiet, some answering questions, some avoiding questions. But they were all there, and as I saw it, evaluating their teacher. So I felt the pressure and the need to prepare carefully, and I did that. The other bump, I suppose, was I started teaching in 1966. And I was leaving the practice, the hubbub of practice, the telephone calls constant, the busy practice, and I envisioned a quiet and contemplative life. But the years 1966 to 1972 on college campuses in this country was a battlefield. I mean, there were demonstrations for diversity. There were anti-war demonstrations against the Vietnam War. There were some assaults on the Cornell campus during that period. There were all kinds of demonstrations. And even if you can imagine this, in the law school, for 2 days, the law faculty was asked to stand guard through the night in shifts because the law school building was deemed to be perhaps an attractive target for vandalism or for burning because it symbolized law and authority. And we did that. Security forces were stretched out elsewhere. And so that was a tenor that conflicted with my preparation for class. But harmony was restored. There were reforms in place, and the law school was not affected, and the university survived and prospered. Let me say, really in closing, that I owe Cornell a tremendous debt. It shaped my life in so many ways. I have admired and regarded fondly all of the people that I have encountered. God knows there's a long profession of great deans, including Stewart, whose particular distinct way, have provided great leadership. My colleagues on the faculty, as Kevin Clermont demonstrated, have been extremely gracious and tolerant, and I thank them for that. Administrators, staff, students, and alumni, I also thank. I single out Professor Clermont because although he minimized his role, he's really the civil procedure guru. I would go to him and I would talk to him about civil procedure. I would ask his help and his advice, and he never disappointed. I would say the same also for the years that he was here about Professor Kent, who was always very helpful and who had more experience in civil procedure, I think, than I did at any time. I love this law school, and I will try to stay connected, but I know that I will miss the law school and the parts of it every day of the rest of my life. Thank you.
I do want to thank Kevin Arquette, Steve Robinson, and Kevin Clermont for their comments, but obviously most especially Professor Faust Rossi. We've got a couple of gifts for you, really as tokens of our appreciation, but we hope they help keep the memories alive. If you'll come over here, I think, Faust, the first one, I think fairly obviously, is under this little curtain here. And so if you'll help us unveil it, we'll see what it is. And what it is a framed photograph of the Gould Reading Room in the Cornell Law Library, where you've spent, of course, many an hour. And so we give it to you with our thanks and deep appreciation. Again, you're taking emeritus status. You know, the retiring, I don't know, and staying with us for sure, and staying deeply connected is something we want. So please take this with our deepest thanks.
Do you recognize it?
And then we have a framed photograph of the Cornell Law Forum that happens to have your picture in the Gould Reading Room on it. And it says, it's the spring 2013 version, legendary speaker, inspiring teacher, valued mentor, trusted colleague, Professor Faust Rossi. Please accept this with our thanks. And I most especially want to thank all of you, the alumni of Cornell Law School, the former students of Professor Faust Rossi, for this special evening. Thank you all, and this, I think, concludes our reunion. Thank you so much, except for the dinner, the sort of the music and dancing to follow. Let's collaborate. Thank you very much.